Jill's trip to Germany, recent back in the month of May, and to say inform, but maybe the word alert will apply to some people, alert us about her personal readiness to go. Let's go is kind of where she's at, right? And so we want you to know that that's where things are at. And we also want to build some understanding about missing pieces of this puzzle so that we can, as a church body, with the help of the Spirit, the guidance of the Spirit, that we can discern and pray and even, in ways that it's appropriate, decide how best to fill the needs that are still here. But here's the great thing. We have seen God working. We've prayed for a place. He's given us a place. Don't want to get ahead of ourselves. And so because God has been answering, we fully anticipate He's going to keep answering prayer. We just need to remain in prayer and worship and embrace perhaps fasting so that we can see what the next steps look like. So Jill, tell us then about this recent trip to Germany and the clarity that you received about where God is leading you.
Okay, so testing. Yep, there we are.
Mm-hmm.
So Olga and I went to Germany for about a week. I wish we could have gone longer, but just with our time constraints, that's how it worked out. And ahead of time, we prayed about which cities we should go to. And so we had 6 cities picked out. We were in each one for about one night, and it was Olga had a few that she felt were on her heart. I had a couple that were on my heart, and as we did that, one of the ones especially stood out. I think if God had called me to any of them, I would have said, yes, this is a good place to be. But there was one in particular, and it's called Pforzheim. The P is silent. I realize it's not the easiest to pronounce, but God didn't call me there because it was easy to pronounce. Yeah, as we were coming into the city, I just felt this. It's interesting that you used the word weight earlier, because it was almost the weight that was almost like a weighted blanket that was on me, and could just feel that there was something that God was doing. And I actually wasn't talking quite as much on that drive, because it was just this feeling of a shift, that there was something I was supposed to be paying attention to. I was supposed to be looking out the windows and paying attention to my surroundings, and it got the impression that this is home, that this is where I'm supposed to be. Out of faithfulness, we continued on the rest of our journey, because that was about day 2. And I said, I want to make sure that there's no other place that feels the same way. And it did not. And so at the end of the trip, I also said, Olga, what do you think? And she said, I could see you being in Pforzheim. I could see you living there. And so at the end, I said, okay, I think this is where God's calling me to be.
Good. And I know that, Jill, as you and I have talked many times in getting to know you over the years, there may be a sort of subjectivity that people are hearing that some of us may be less comfortable, more comfortable. But one thing that I've appreciated is about, even as you've taken my kids on little trips and excursions, is your willingness to sit with, where is God leading me? And these aren't things like the Bible has already spoken on. Right? To the nations. Amen. God said that, right? But, okay, God, I'm opening myself up to, do you want me to go up this set of steps in the subway or this set of steps in the subway? Saying, Lord, where would you have me to go? I'll go this way. And then see how God blesses in those ways. Now, we could have a long conversation about when that's appropriate, when that's not, and so forth. But as you hear that, if you have questions about it, ask more questions about it. And kind of learn kind of how Jill has experienced God's work in her life in this way. Some of us may learn some things. I'm sure you could learn some things along the way too, because you're still very open to that. So you have this city-to-city journey. You come to Pforzheim. Tell us a little bit about Pforzheim, demographics.
Sure. So Pforzheim is about 125,000 people, which is interesting because that's almost the exact size of Allentown, which... It's just interesting that God kind of did all that. It has a long history, because a lot of cities in Europe do, but it's also had a lot of destruction along the way. Got destroyed it was built by the Romans, got destroyed a couple times with armies that were just crisscrossing Europe in the medieval times. It got pretty badly bombed out right before the end of World War II, which is still very difficult for the people of Pforzheim. One of the people I was talking to there said they're still very discouraged about that, because it was in late February. It was February 23rd, And that's so close to when the war ended, which was early May, that a lot of them think, couldn't you have won the war without destroying our city? I think the statistic was 70% of buildings were destroyed within about 20 minutes. And now I can't remember how many thousands of people died, but it was several
20,
thousand people died.
20, I think.
20,000. That sounds right. 20,000 people died within a few minutes because of those waves of bombings. They actually faced another disaster in the 1960s. A pretty major tornado went through. Apparently it was an F4. I had to look that up because we don't live with a lot of tornadoes around here. And apparently an F4 is a pretty big tornado. And if they have one of those out in the west, they do call it a big deal. And they don't really have tornadoes in Germany. I think they even called it a tornado because they don't have a German word for tornado. They just don't have them there, and yet this major one went through Pforzheim in the early 1960s and was destroying a lot of buildings. So they've had a lot of destruction. They've watched other cities nearby like Stuttgart and Bonn economically prosper, and they don't really know why they were left out. And that is this general discouragement that the city's feeling. But that actually makes me want to embrace them more. People who have their lives together don't always understand their deep need for Jesus. We all have a deep need for Jesus, but when someone feels like they have their life together, they might not recognize it. I think it is the people who understand that there's something missing in their life, that they can't do this by themselves, who are the ones who start saying, you know what, I do need God. I need Jesus. I need somebody to step in and help me here. Pforzheim is also not just Germans. I think it's easy for us to think of Germany as a whole bunch of white people running around, and it's more than that. There are about 60% of the city is now made up of people who were born in another country or whose parents were born in another country. They do have a university there that attracts a lot of people from, I met people from Latin America. When I was walking around with Olga, she said, you know, those people were speaking Russian just now. I'm like, okay, like I didn't know it was Russian. If you look up the actual statistics, it talks about Turkish people. Turkish people have been in Germany since the 1950s or so. You can hear Arabic speaking. I was walking near Airbnb and I heard Italian. Our waitress was Romanian. There was just a lot of languages, a lot of people who are represented there. And what's fascinating to me is that some of those countries, it would be difficult for us to get into. Especially if you remember about 10, 15 years ago, there was a wave of immigrants coming from Africa. There were waves in the past few years of immigrants coming from Syria and Iraq. There's waves of immigrants right now coming from Ukraine. These would be, like, I would not want to go to Ukraine right now. I don't know about you, but I don't want to go there right now. I don't want to go to Iraq right now. There's certain countries in Africa I would not want to go to right now. It's just pretty dangerous. Yet they are coming to Germany, which is a country which is relative safety. It'd be great if they were coming to the United States and we could serve them here and tell them about Jesus here, but they're not. They're going to Germany because it's closer. So that does give an opportunity to not only minister to the people who live in Germany, but also to the people who are coming out of there. Also, we usually think about Germany as being a Christian country, and that certainly was true historically. We have some great pioneers of the Christian faith who were present in Germany, and I love that about Germany. But I also know that as a country as a whole, they're down to about 2% of the population actually attends church on a regular basis and has a vibrant relationship with Jesus. Pforzheim does happen to be in the Bible Belt, which means that we're closer to 10%, but that's still actually comparatively pretty low. And a thing about Germany is that they have something called the state church, which is kind of sponsored by the government, but the state church is not necessarily pastored by a Christian. There are some exceptions to that, but by and large, most of the state churches will have non-believers, people who would not say that Jesus is God who died on the cross, like all those basic Apostles' Creed things that we went through a few months ago. They would not necessarily agree to that. As we were preparing for our trip, I was looking for a church to attend, and I wasn't quite sure how to Google it, but I was checking for some, and there was a church in one city which it was talking about its activities. Like I was looking at the calendar, and if you look at the activities on our calendars, it's church picnics and small group and meeting with missionaries who are coming to our church. And in this one, it was more things like, we're going to have a lecture on how to garden well. And I think gardening is great. I don't want to belittle gardening, but that's not what we meet together as a church to do. Our lectures, our gatherings are so much more than that. And when I'm looking through their calendar and I can't find small groups and I can't find times when they're learning about Jesus, then that's when my red flags go up, and I think maybe that's not a church I would send people to if they just become a Christian.
Mm-hmm. So give us a little synopsis, a description of the work that you believe God's calling you to do there.
So my passion in Germany, or around here I guess as well, ends up being a large part of that is discipleship. And by discipleship I mean walking with people and teaching them more about Jesus. Sometimes those are literal walks that I go on around here, but other times it can mean meeting with people on a regular basis and saying, how are you doing? What is God doing in your life? What happened this week that you might need another believer to speak into? I saw a lot of opportunities in Germany as well for growth in terms of biblical learning. The church that we attended that Sunday morning, the sermon was probably only about 20 minutes. I think it had something to do with their broadband and how much their Wi-Fi could handle when they wanted to post the sermon. But the pastor spent some time talking about how Luke and Acts are basically just one continuous book, and that if you didn't have John in the middle, you could stick it together. And that is completely true. But I don't think Jim would ever talk about that in a Sunday morning sermon, because he kind of assumes we already know that. And I think we do. I think if he were to drone on about that for 5 minutes, most of us would be like, well, yeah, why just get to the next point? But nobody was bored there. I got the impression they didn't already have that basic biblical knowledge. And that, when I looked around, I saw that's an opportunity. They just need somebody to go over some of the basics of the Bible and say, here's what's in the Bible, and here's what God says about who he is, and here's some basic stories. You know, if you think about, if you had never gone to, some of the kids in our church have the great opportunity of going to not only Sunday school here, but going to Christian schools locally. And if you didn't have those opportunities, and if you didn't grow up in a family that was teaching you that, when would you learn it? Has anybody, it comes to has anybody talked to you about the importance of reading the Bible on a daily basis? If no one has taught you that that's important, then why would you do that? And why would you understand that? So I think in a lot of ways, Pforzheim, Germany as a whole, just needs believers who come in and say, here's a good biblical practice. Praying is a good biblical practice. Reading the Bible is a good biblical practice. After you master that, let's maybe talk about fasting and what it could be. But just some of those basic things. I also have a deep belief that prayer is vital. It's one reason I'm on the prayer team here, and I show up before church every Sunday. I'm here and I say I'm going to pray for the service. Prayer is not just a nice thing we do, it is imperative to anything that happens, and it is something I look so forward to, is just going and praying over the city, praying over individuals, and saying, God, what is it that you want to do here, and how can I partner with it? What are the strategies you want us to use? I also love kids. As Jim has referred to, I do help teach Sunday school here, and part of me would love to do that every week, just I know that would not actually be good for me as a Christian if I were never in church with the rest of you. I really respect and love what Meredith does. I also know that if we did not have Meredith here, Jenny also shared with us that she has the ability, she could run the kids team if Meredith wasn't here. And if Jenny and Meredith weren't here, I could do it as well. I have the training for that, but I let other people do it because they are skilled at it, and because I have a job and other areas that are keeping me busy. But it's something where I would love to be able to go to Germany and say, hey, if you need this, I'd be happy to do this. I've helped run VBSs before. I can write curriculum for those things. I don't know if they need someone, but I'm aware that in the United States we have a distinct advantage of that we can look at multiple Sunday school curriculums. We can look at VBS curriculum if a church ever wants to do VBS and say, this is what we can choose. They may or may not have those opportunities in Europe. They don't have as many translations of the Bible. They might not have as many Jesus Storybook Bibles that are already translated in. So then you say, okay, how can I help knowing that I've got this knowledge? And in what ways can I help the kids? What ways can I help the adults grow in their faith? whether by walking with them or helping provide curriculum or just praying over the church and the city as a whole.
Yeah. I know that we continue to highlight that there really shouldn't be that much of a distance between what our global partners do and what we do. And I think you're hearing here from Jill, she's not pulling out something that is really foreign to us, right, or really complex and complicated. God calls certain people to go and start seminaries in other countries and things like that. But what I think Jill is describing is God is, she believes, calling her to go and take the gifts she has, many of which have been used here at GraceWay, and carry them over into Germany, and in a way where perhaps you could say, maybe more so than here, that you would be helping to build the very foundation stones of faith, because it's so underdeveloped there by so many. Would you agree with that description?
I would. So, sorry, I could put the mic too close there. So, one thing I've also realized is a term I have not used to describe myself is church planter. And that's because I'm not going over there attempting to start a new church. And the reasons behind that are, first of all, I'm just one person, and I really think church planting is best done by a team. And secondly, because I'm a female, then that just ends up being much more complicated in terms of you could plant a church, but you can't preach there, and just kind of all those threads. So I'm not looking to plant a new church. I'm looking to come alongside the churches that already exist there, but it's still that I still have the heart of a church planter. And if there were a team going, if there were another, like we talked to the Bennetts a couple weeks or last week, and they were talking about how they are founding a church, but they have other people on their team. And I start thinking, well, what is Erin's role in this? Erin's role is that she goes along and she meets with other women and she helps in any way she can, and she is in many ways a church planter, even if she's not up front on Sunday morning. And so in many ways I resonate with that a lot, of that I have the heart of a church planter. My parents were church planters. I was trained on how to church plant. I just haven't usually officially labeled myself as that because I'm not starting a new church. But there are churches already in Pforzheim, not just the state churches. They call them free churches because you don't have to pay taxes to go there, which is a whole other thing, which I can give you more history about Germany if you're interested about that. But there are free churches there, and I want to come alongside of them. I want to help them be more healthy. I want to partner with them in ways that they're already established, but that doesn't mean they don't need help.
Good. We have a number of questions that I know each answer could be about 5 to 10 minutes, and we'd be here much longer, but for sake of time, and we talked recently, right, and said this conversation is going to be teased out in different settings along the way. And so hopefully this is stirring some thoughts, ideas, questions that you have that you can continue to pursue Jill about, and then we as a church are going to make into a larger conversation where it's appropriate. So you have partnered with an organization called GOI. Let us know what those letters stand for and give us like the 1 to 2 minute version of how they serve you so far.
So GOI stands for Global Outreach International. It's on the screen there. And one thing there's a couple things I really appreciate about them. One is that a lot of organizations that I looked at said, this is where we have our team, you can take it or leave it. GOI has really said to all of its missionaries, where is God calling you and how can we support you in that? So when I said, I feel called to Pforzheim, they didn't say no, they said, great, let's get behind you on that. They had an orientation that was just really impactful in terms of making sure we understood cultural training and fundraising and just letting us know we're supported. I really appreciate how they have made it a priority to have a care team who is consistently reaching out to me. They have a prayer team that meets once a week, and they are consistently saying, how can we pray for you? They have a yearly retreat, which I had the privilege of going on, and I wasn't quite sure what that would look like, but it really was a great time to connect not only with the leaders of GOI, but also to network with other missionaries. And I was able to learn a lot from them in terms of what bumps they experienced along the way and what challenges were they facing and what their stories had been, and yeah, just all of the creative ways God has of working around the world. The more I hear about how different missionaries are reaching their people, it gives me more ideas of this is how God might want to work someday in Germany.
Good. Good. And something about GOI that might be a little different than other organizations is some of the things they do are very much the same, very helpful logistically, but is one thing that's unique about GOI is the way that they want to facilitate the sending church to accomplish what God's doing in that church and in that individual. And that doesn't mean other organizations don't do that as well, but what it ends up doing, and something we'll talk more about, is it puts a little bit more into the sending church's court than other organizations might. And so that's why we want to be right on the edge of our seat listening to each step of this journey, because it's always true that churches should send missionaries, right, rather than missions agencies. But there are certain things that will be in our court, and we'll talk more and more about those as time goes by. What I've heard about GOI is that Jill feels very encouraged. You're refreshed each time you go and come back, and that's a good thing to see in one of our missionaries. Speaking of refreshment and encouragement, tell us 1 to 2 minute version of the Barnabas team. Tell us about that.
So GOI, one of their requirements for every missionary is that we have a Barnabas team. They recognize that we need people who are checking in with us. And so they have asked us to each have a group of 3 to 5 people. We have to have at least one from our sending church who is going to be regularly checking in with us. And those are people who are supporting us in prayer, who are open to visiting us at some point when we're overseas, who are really reporting back to the church while here, that they're possibly attending missions conferences, that they're learning more about missions on a regular basis, and just kind of being our advocate here in the United States. Well, both our advocate with the people who would have sent us, our advocate with the church that has sent us, as well as our encouragement. That is what Barnabas is known for. Barnabas was not his real name, but Barnabas is his nickname because it was called Son of Encouragement, and that he was just such an encourager to everybody in the church. So the Barnabas team is meant to be a group that is encouraging me, which with my hope being I also encourage them back. Like, as we talked about last week with Meredith's little circle thing here, it's a partnership, and just because people are praying for me doesn't mean I'm not going to pray for them. Like, I want to encourage my Barnabas team back and pray for people who are praying for me.
Good. And thank you for those who are on that Barnabas team and you're in the room. We can acknowledge them later, but to know that that effort is already there, and you poured your heart and aspects of your life into partnering with Jill on this journey. And so that already exists and is developing, because you'll have meetings along the way with them coming up. To kind of put some things into a nutshell, we talk about pieces of the puzzle that are missing. One of them is mastering the language, which you plan to take at least the first year and really focus on that. And so we can learn more about that in the future, what that language learning journey might look like specifically. You can ask her those questions. She's referring to churches in Fort Sign, but not the church that she'll be a part of, because we don't know yet. And so we're going to pray through and discern that together, because one of the reasons is we want to be able to, as we've done with the Templetons, as we desire to do with the Bennetts and the Sykes, is send our people there and partner there and see what God's doing. And as we invest in Jill, if she's disciple making, those disciples are being added to a church. So we're not only investing in Jill, we're investing in the church that she'll be a part of. And so this is a key piece of the puzzle that we'll pursue God for and inform you about along the way. And then within that church, or connected to Jill when she gets there, is a handful of individuals who will be like a Barnabas team, but over there. And so this is something that, again, until perhaps she's there or she's had more opportunity to meet people there, but we want to pray for that to develop as Jill goes. And let's see, God's timing in all of this. This kind of brings us to the idea of financial support. And again, this is the nutshell version, but in terms of financial support and time frame, right? You need to be fully supported before you can leave. Right. We are careful to share the exact number, because that's still being discerned as to what it would take to be there for a year's time. But when it comes to giving, let's do this. Go right to where we kind of landed our previous conversation. how would you encourage us to think about giving? And we also talked about the work of the Spirit, right? We so often can get to money and we think that, how does the Spirit fit in this? Because we look at dollars and cents, right? And Americans look on return on investment as well, but that's another story, right? So we're giving. We have the work of the Spirit leading all of this. Share with the body kind of what you were sharing with me that I think is really challenging and encouraging.
So a lot of this is kind of actually building off of something that Mark said 3 weeks ago in his sermon. Mark was talking about how he was referring to Jude verse 20, and it says to pray in the Holy Spirit. And Mark defined that as, instead of us coming up with a plan and saying, God, please bless that plan, it's instead saying, going to God and saying, God, what is your plan? And believing that God, in his sovereignty, can put thoughts in our mind, and that we can double check and say, God, is that from you? Yes, okay. And we could even double check with other people and say, does that sound like it's from God? And going from there. So yes, a big part of me getting to Germany has to do with financial support. When people have asked, when are you going? The answer is, I'm going to go when I'm fully funded. That said, I need financial support. I also don't actually think that probably all of you are called to financial support me. What I believe is that all of you are probably called to support a missionary somewhere in some organization, but I can't discern that for all of you. So what I would actually encourage all of you to do is pray about whether or not you are called to support a missionary. And if it happens to be me, great. And if not, I would be honored to help you figure out who you are supposed to support. Maybe it is a missionary who already has come by. There are multiple people I know through GOI. There's people I know with other organizations. And if you are called to support them, then I want to help you get you plugged into that. I know baseball ministry in Guatemala and camp ministry in Costa Rica and feeding children in Kenya and campus ministry in Bulgaria and people in closed countries, which I can talk to you about in person. But that idea of, if I'm okay if you're not called to support me, but I do believe God has called you to support some missionaries in some capacity. And maybe you're already doing that, but if you're not, I would love to help you figure out who that is. And for all of those cases, instead of saying, this is what I think I'm supposed to do, instead saying, God, what is your plan and what do you want me to do?
Good. And so just to make sure Jill's encouragement there is clear, she's saying you, and often we use the word you and we mean the plural you, all of us together. She's actually referring to you as the individual or your family unit or, right, maybe your small group. And you say, how can I support Jill? Now, a conversation we'll have as a church, and our normal budget routine is to come toward the end of the year and determine how we're going to support missionaries. And, we can kind of usurp that and have that conversation at different times, but that's our normal process. So it would be expected that we'll talk about how the church at large will give, but your encouragement is be individually part of missions.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. That I believe there's a place for all of us as individuals to be doing that. I would love it if everyone in our church is on my prayer support list, because while I am trying to raise financial support, I really also value prayer support. That in some ways, I mean, it's risky to say that's more valuable, but in some ways it is. Mm-hmm. That there are, when I lived in Japan for 3 years, which most of you know, and when I lived in Japan, because I had a job, I did not need financial support. I did not raise financial support, but I did raise prayer support. I had a list of 80 to 85 people who had volunteered, who had signed up, and said, yes, we want to pray for you. And I emailed them every single month with stories of, here's what God has been doing, or here's a specific person who's really been on my heart, and I would love it if you could pray for them. And here's this really cool thing that happened this week. And I actually love writing these newsletters. It's one reason I can say I will be sending these newsletters, because I did it for 3 years, and I did it every month, and I loved doing it. And so I don't know if everyone in this room is called to give to me individually financially, but I would love it if you are all up for getting my newsletters and praying for me, because that is also so valuable. And it doesn't matter what your income is, because everyone can pray. So that includes the teenagers, by the way. And if there's kids who don't have email addresses, I'd love to find a way to let them know what the prayer requests are as well.
Good, good. Well, that's a very tangible way to finish the conversation in terms of giving, but I bring us back to the work of the Spirit. One comment just before we go. I said, hey, we're not sharing that amount that Jill needs. It's not that she doesn't have any idea of what that is. Just we're encouraging her not to live on peanut butter and ramen. So we need to make sure that that number is accurate, because Jill, if you know Jill, she might be willing to do that. And so we want to encourage her. Let's keep those numbers as realistic as we can. So Jill's willing to hear that and let us work with her on that. But the theme of all of this is the work of the Spirit through our church. It has tangible aspects, very practical things like giving and percentages and how much we're going to give and what that might look like. It looks like getting on planes and going overseas, but ultimately this is the spiritual work of God in the world, and it is through the power of the Spirit. So to finish sort of how our challenge earlier from the Word ended, perhaps the best way right now, this week, yes, consider giving and those things, but the best way to support Jill or prepare to support Jill is to be a worshiping, fasting, and praying Christian, and us being a worshiping, fasting, and praying church. And then let's see what God will do. As you have questions for Jill along the way, please ask her. This is a process we're all learning from, and it's really good for us as a church to do this. So let's stand. We're going to have to finish there. I'm sorry, worship team, but we'll finish there, and then we need to grab a slice and get over to the Thompson's place for the baptism to come. So